Oh, thank you. I'm amazed that there were so many people wanted to come out to hear a 5-hour lecture on Sudbury, England. Sudbury, England was founded in 1215. No, what? Oh, the other Sudbury. Sudbury, Massachusetts. Growing up, I was always very aware that there were 3, but of course there was only 1 for us. Sudbury's landscape when I was growing up in the 1950s and 1960s was desolate at the best, but nevertheless there was a strange beauty to the barrenness of those black hills, however unnatural it might have seemed to the outsider. Conversely, downtown Sudbury in the late 1960s was a happening place. It was filled with busy stores and restaurants and coffee houses and theaters, and most of all, people. I was barely a teenager myself in the late 1960s, but I remember that time like it was yesterday. The music, the characters I met, and yes, the first joint I ever smoked. One of my favorite things I used to love to do was on a Friday night in the late 60s was to take a walk downtown, especially along Durham Street. Sudbury was always considered a safe city, so the idea of a 14-year-old going downtown alone wasn't a big deal, even though it was the height of the hippie era, when the clothes made the man, or in my case, the boy. It was the summer of 1969 when my parents felt I was old enough to start hanging out unaccompanied in downtown Sudbury. I grew up in Northern Heights, a quiet suburb in the North End, so the thought of going town was an absolutely thrilling thought. My older brother John was in a very popular Sudbury band known as the Inferno 5+1, so he always had the latest clothes craze. And because we were almost the same size, I would borrow his clothes and head on downtown. So there I was in paisley bell-bottom pants with a black and white zigzag shirt, feeling all that as I sat on the Donovan bus heading down a Friday night adventure. I always had the same route. The bus would let me off at Beach and Elgin, where the old fire hall was. I'd walk by the Empire and Plaza theaters to see what was playing, and then over to the Nickel Range Hotel to see if I knew anyone out to hang out with. At 16, I remember the Nickel Range Hotel at that moment in time had a reputation as a rough and tough place where a lot of biker gangs hung out, and any respectable teenager would stay clear. So, of course, I made a beeline to Sudbury's most famous hotel. However, it wasn't always like that, for when it was first built in 1914, the hotel was the last word in northern luxury, with its elegant facade complete with a French-styled canopy entrance topped off with an enormous hanging cornice that would become the hotel's signature feature. The hotel, originally owned by D.M. Moran, who made a fortune in mining, decided to name the new hotel Nickel Range, inspired by the idea of Sudbury's bright and promising future. When the hotel opened in 1914, then at a staggering cost of $75,000, it was a magnificent structure built in the Renaissance architectural style, so said the newspaper of the day, the Sudbury Journal. One of the employees at the time of the new hotel's opening was a 16-year-old elevator operator, Zellers, who one day would buy the Nickel Range, and along with his sons Maurice, Jean-Paul, and Raymond, the family would run the hotel for the rest of its existence. It was Maurice who befriended a young Alex Trebek, whose own father was the pastry chef at the Nickel Range in the 1940s. The Nickel Range Hotel defined downtown Sudbury and the city itself. The name alone was as Sudbury as you can get. We were the nickel capital of the world, and many of us had a parent, including my own father, who made a living mining nickel. Those first years back in 1914, you would enter the hotel through a revolving door after walking up several steps from the sidewalk and into a magnificent lobby. Now, in my day, the revolving doors were replaced by these huge glass doors that had enormous wooden handles on it that always reminded me of 2 huge spare ribs. Originally, the impressive lobby had wooden floors, grand columns, all touched off with gold leaf and hanging lamps, and a striking wooden staircase leading up to the mezzanine floor where the dining room was connected. Now, it must have been, in its day, I mean, where else? They had a dining room that was inspired after the Versailles, Louis XIV. I mean, this was the Nickel Range Hotel. But by the time I discovered it in the late 1960s, most of these features were gone, and that more elegant post-war look took over from that once elegant Edwardian hotel. What I remember most about Sudbury's most iconic hotel was the Matador Room, a great place for steaks, the Matador Room. Even though by the late 1960s the hotel was starting to show its age, the Matador was still a happening place with their cigarette match covers having a little matador and a bull on its cover. When I discovered the hotel in the 1960s, downstairs there was a hair salon called My Fair Lady, and next to that was the men's barbershop, and the kitchens were still also downstairs. The hotel's barbershop also had direct access from Elm Street. Now, the downstairs also shared the space with the hotel's coffee shop, where the bikers hung out on a Saturday afternoon. In 1967, a then unknown band named Steppenwolf, on passing through Sudbury, were booked into the Nickel Range Hotel. The band, known for Born to be Wild, was extremely popular with biker gangs all over North America, and Sudbury had its fair share that hung out in that coffee shop. I discovered the Nickel Range the same time I fell in love with detective novels and movies like The Big Sleep and The Maltese Falcon. In order to feed my obsession, I decided to start up my own faux detective agency as a joke in Sudbury in 1969. I even found an office space. And it even had a little door that had a little glass window on, just like Philip Marlowe, except mine was on the top floor of the old Silverman's department store over on Elm. And they had no idea I was there. Back then, he went to the top floor of the old Silverman's, and he went through a door that said, "Do not enter," which of course I entered. It brought you to an old warehouse that used to stand at the very back. So I was wandering through this warehouse, and I found this do not enter sign. In I go, sat down. I even had little cards printed up that said B&B Detective Agency. Just ask around. All for fun, of course. But, however, someone did ask around and wanted to hire me to find someone she thought was tailing her. My client was a sex worker and asked me to meet her in her room at the Nickel Range Hotel. I had never been in any of the bedrooms at the Nickel Range up to this time, so this was going to be a whole new experience. I remember the hallways being very dark with the smell of beer wafting up from the lounge downstairs. The hotel rooms still had their transom windows above their doors from the days before air conditioning. This allowed for airflow. If I ever wanted to be a Raymond Chandler character, it was now. I knocked on the door and was told to come in. So there I was, 16 years old, alone in a hotel room with a chain-smoking, gin-drinking prostitute who was handing me a fistful of crumpled bills to find a man she said was a do-gooder from the Sally Ann. My first question was, what's the Sally Ann? The Salvation Army, she said, followed by, are you sure you're a detective? I never did find it because I never looked, and I never did take her money, and yet I couldn't believe that I took my mania that far. It was a side of Sudbury that was completely foreign to me, a kid from the suburbs who wasn't even sure what a prostitute was. I wouldn't say the Nickel Range at this time was as frightening as the Frontenac on Durham, or the Ramsay on Elm, or the scariest of them all, the Queen's on Borgia, but to a 16-year-old, these hotels still held a great amount of fascination as I wondered just what was going on in those rooms. The Nickel Range was a cornerstone for downtown Sudbury, especially for everything west of Elgin Street. Newer and flashier hotels like the Ambassador and the Sorrento were built in the 1960s out in the suburbs, but the old ones downtown still held on as drinking lounges. There was talk in the 1960s of renovating the Nickel Range that would have included a rooftop patio and a larger ballroom, but money worries and heavy debts ended that dream. The hotel, once described as the best hotel between Winnipeg and Toronto, while rough around the edges, still held a place in the hearts of Sudburyans. Sadly, the hotel closed, and by June 1975, an auction was held, selling off hundreds of mementos before it was ultimately demolished in 1976. The Nickel Range was only 62 years old, and astonishingly, it's been gone for 45 years. But to many of us, its silhouette is a memory that is ingrained in us forever. The Nickel Range should have been renovated into a first-class hotel or a condo. It was a historic landmark, much like the Royal York Hotel is to Toronto, the Plaza to New York City, the Nickel Range west to Sudbury. The Nickel Range was an iconic, historic, and defining symbolic local treasure. Leaving the Nickel Range, I would cross the street and head into Zellers at Elm and Elgin. One of the mainstays of downtown Sudbury in the 1960s was the Zellers store on the northeast corner of Elm and Elgin. Founded in 1931, was a Canadian discount chain based in Brampton that was acquired by the Hudson's Bay Company in 1978. The Sudbury Zellers store was part of the so-called trifecta of stores that I used to visit every Saturday as a teenager in the 1960s, the others being Kresge's and Woolworth. The Zellers store replaced the iconic Balmoral Hotel built in 1887 that at one time stood at that corner. In the late 1950s, we lived on Ethelbert Street in the West End, and our neighbor's son got the job of manager of the brand new Zellers store opening in 1958. It was at the time of the hula hoop craze, and because of his position as manager, we were the first kids in Sudbury to actually play with this new 1950s toy phenomenon. On Friday night, I would head downtown, and to Zellers was the first store that I would visit. I remember you would enter the store on the Elgin Street side, and because the staircase was right there, I made a beeline downstairs, and from what I remember, it was a very wide staircase. Downstairs at Zellers had a great pet store that took up a quarter of the space of what was a very substantial lower level. That pet store had the most exotic fish and mice and rats and puppies and kittens and all kinds of birds. What made the pet store at Zellers even more exciting to a youngster at that time was that it shared the space with the toy department. From what I recall, Zellers' toy department took up most of the northwest section of the downstairs, with the boys' stuff like cars, model, airplanes, were all along the western wall, and the girls' toys, as they were known back then, including the new must-have Barbie doll, was in the middle aisles. The downstairs seemed to have all the fun stuff, the pet store and toys and kids' clothes. In hindsight, very smart marketing. As you made your way through the bottom level, you would head up the escalator. Unlike Kresge's and Woolworth, where their escalators were positioned in the center of the store, Zellers had theirs positioned against the western wall. The main floor was men's and ladies' department, and the record store, which was located at the back. The record department would move about the store over the years as time went by, but I do recall I have a memory of the record department at one time being downstairs amongst the toys and pets. What I also remember about the main floor of Zellers was the light. Huge floor to ceiling windows brought in a lot of natural light into that store. I like to believe that Sudbury entered the modern age of mercantile architecture with the building of that Zellers store. The Zellers store was one of the first modern buildings in Sudbury to be constructed in the modern post-war international style of architecture, where more is less and where open interior space is light and airy. Toronto had the TD Centre, New York City had the Seagram's building, and we had Zellers. This was a vast departure from Silverman's, an older and much higher-end department store across the street. Silverman's was never on my regular visits, for it didn't have a restaurant, and if it did, it didn't cater to a younger crowd, and from what I remember, it didn't even have a record department. The two things teenagers like myself wanted most in a store. Silverman's also created a more, catered to a more mature crowd, and from what I can remember in the few visits that I made there with my mom, who loved shopping there, it was very, very dimly lit, with lots of dark wood, giving it an almost gloomy appearance. But in retrospection, this design was to give Silverman's a somewhat stately appearance that appealed to the more upscale shopper. Zellers was the complete opposite, bright, airy, and lots of light. Also, too, was the exterior with its yellow brick facade and black buff marble that perfectly offset the signage, spelling out Zellers in a greenish tint. Interestingly, with all that natural light, sometimes in the summer, huge awnings would be installed on the windows, I assume to keep the store cool. The other exterior architectural feature on this contemporary brick box was the chimney that rose above the roof at the north end, flush with the wall, creating a very modern outline. All of this extremely fashionable for the time. Now, luckily, that chimney survived when the building went through a massive overhaul in the 1990s, becoming Place Balmoral, its name an homage to the previous Balmoral Hotel. After leaving Zellers, I would head back out onto Elm Street and into the pool hall next door. Pool halls seemed to be everywhere back then, and even though I never played the game, I got a thrill that I was doing something dangerous just by being in there. Next to the pool hall was the Bright's wine store. And while I was only 14 or 15, I remember going in there and buying a bottle of white wine. I looked older, and this must have been in the days before clerks were required to ask for ID. I drank it, got really sick, and never had another drink for another 10 years. What I also remember is above the wine store were the offices of Peter Lush Real Estate, which I always thought was a fun name of a real estate guy above a wine store. After a quick visit to the dark side, I would head into Kresge's. Next door, through a double set of wooden doors, the first thing to check out the albums. Before a dollar store and Walmart and online shopping, there was the SS Kresge's, named for Sebastian Kresge's, a one-stop heavenly shopping emporium on the north side of Elm between Durham and Elgin Street, now 66 Elm Street. It was my favorite store growing up in 1960 Sudbury. You would enter Kresge's through wooden revolving doors on Elm Street, and the first thing would be, when you entered, was the cigarette counter, and then the record department, where I bought all my Beatle albums. And then you made your way to the back, you would pass through the greeting card section, and then into the Richmond Room, a great cafeteria that served roast beef daily. The Richmond Room was named for the Richmond Room at Toronto's Kresge store on Richmond Street. And it was a pretty high-end establishment for a Kresge store. The restaurant had red leather banquette seating around the edge and tables and chairs in the middle, and was a great place to meet after school or a respite from shopping on a busy Saturday. Continuing through the restaurant were the women's fashions and the downstairs restrooms. There was also a small customer service desk under the escalator that had a pneumatic vacuum tube relay system where office workers would put their documents, bills, and etc. into a tube, and it would be whisked upstairs to the main office. As a child, I was completely fascinated with this newfangled gadget that predates fax machines and email attachments. In the center of the store was flanked by the up and down escalators. The story goes that Kresge's had the first escalator in Sudbury when it first opened in 1935. When the store expanded after the Second World War, the escalators were updated, and it was those new escalators I remember having pale green siding on them. The staircase and escalator in the center of the store gave the store a grand look. And what a better place to stage Kresge's secret weapon. At the bottom of the staircase stood the formidable headwalker, Mrs. Doreen Moore, gazing out at her employees and keeping an eye on unruly customers, usually teenagers like myself. While her stern face is ingrained in my memory forever. I have since heard from former employees who absolutely loved her, and she was a wonderful person with a great sense of humor. However stern her look, Mrs. Moore kept that store running in tip-top shape. In the middle of the downstairs was the candy department, a vast area that took up 2 aisles. Most of the candy was loose, wrapped up, and measured out. I remember at Easter the store would have enormous life-size chocolate bunny rabbits all throughout the store. At the front of Kresge's was the men's wallet and watches, and beyond that, at the very front of the store was the famous Kresge's lunch counter with red leatherette swivel bar chairs. And above the lunch counter was a vast mural of the Inco slag pour that ran the whole length of the north end of the store. That epic mural defined the store, making no doubt that you were in Sudbury. Upstairs was the shoe and toy department. I can't believe I'm just wiping my mouth in front of all you people. Oh my God. Okay, all right? Right. Thank you. It helps. Kresge's always seemed to be busy, especially on a Tuesday night when Inco paid its employees, so the store stayed open till 9 p.m. From Kresge's, I would cross the street at the scramble intersection of Durham and Elm and head into Woolworth and directly to their record department. For me, the swinging 60s was downtown Sudbury's golden era. For those lucky enough to come of age in the 1960s, the downtown area truly was a thriving place. And at the center of this vibrant downtown was a department store. And not just any department store. It was a destination. I have such wonderful memories of the former Woolworth store that at one time stood at the intersection of Elm and Durham. The F.W. Woolworth Company opened its first store in Sudbury on the east side of Durham Street between Larch and Cedar in 1916. That first Woolworth was such a hit with the locals, as everything was either 5 cents or 10 cents, hence the name. It was known as the 5 and dime store. But then as Sudbury grew, so did Woolworth. In 1959, where is it? Is that it? Oh, here. It needs an iron. But in 1959, on the southeast corner of Elm and Durham, the old post office, one of the most beautiful buildings Sudbury ever knew, was sadly demolished. And it was here, on that prestigious corner in the downtown core, that Woolworth moved in to one of the tallest buildings in Sudbury, taking over the main and lower floors. The upper floors of this spanking new 5-story building housed the dentists and doctors' offices alongside insurance and loan companies. I remember you would enter Woolworths through its main doors at Durham and Elm, and immediately to your right was the famous Woolworth Bakery. This bakery always displayed its wedding cakes in the front alongside delicious display of this cookies and donuts and cakes and pies, all freshly baked that day in the store. My mother would sometimes bake wedding cake for friends and family and then take them down to Woolworth where the bakers would decorate them. Next to the bakery was the sit-down cafeteria, known for its fries and gravy, and apple dumpling pie with ice cream. The restaurant wasn't as fancy as the one over at the Kresge store down the street, but you did sit in blue and yellow vinyl booths while waitresses in their famous Woolworth uniforms, complete with aprons and paper bonnets, came by to fill your coffee cup. As you made your way to the center of the store, you came to the girls' and women's clothing department, and in the summer, at the front of the store, was all given over to souvenirs, always chock full of big nickel keepsakes. At the back of the store was Woolworth's famous record department. It was here that many of us who grew up in the 60s bought our first Jefferson Airplane albums and Beatle albums, and more importantly, got to talk to other like-minded music lovers. But I should also point out, it wasn't just modern music sold at Woolworth's, because I remember buying my first copy of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony there. Between the restaurant and record department were the photo booth, where you could get 4 black and white photos for 25 cents. I always remember either being alone or with friends, waiting for that light to flash, hoping I wouldn't look like a complete dork when a minute later those photos would slip out of its slot. I still have a few of those photos taken at that booth, and I often think how many people in the days before selfies went to that 25-cent booth. Next to the record department was the men's suit, sock, and underwear section. And on the other side of the store, facing Elm Street, was their lunch counter, where I remember on opening day in 1959, my mom taking me there as they were giving away free banana splits. This iconic dessert was made with ice cream, a split banana, crushed nuts, whipped cream, topped off with a maraschino sherry, all served in a plastic boat. I kept that boat for years, and I wish I still had it. In the middle of the store was an escalator. Gin at 2 o'clock. Best thing about theater. No guilt. Drinking in the afternoon. I kid. Downstairs, you would also find the houseware departments, boys' wear, and a pet store. How many of us bought our first goldfish in a water-filled plastic bag at Woolworth, only to have it flushed down the toilet a week later? At the back of the store, next to the lunch counter, you would go down a few steps and you'd open a glass door which would lead you to the lobby of the office tower where the elevators were. You could also enter the lobby from Elm Street, where the entrance was under an awning that hung underneath the sidewalk. Now, once I discovered this elevator lobby, I would take my friends there to the top of the building, where you can get a pretty good view of the whole east end of downtown Sudbury. Sadly, Woolworth closed in 1994, and the whole building was eventually torn down, and with it, the downtown would change forever. In the 1960s, pop star Petula Clark had an enormous hit record, I Know a Place. I know a place where we can go. At the door, there's a man who will greet you and take you downstairs. It's not the downtown song, it's her other one. And this I Know a Place and the La Fiamma restaurant encompass this hit with its bohemian flair. Now, this restaurant, situated on in a really dark basement on the east side of Durham between Cedar and just south of Cedar, served the best pizza to this day that I have ever had. The tables had checkered tablecloths, the candles were in wine bottles, and the pizza was served to you on a raised plate with a can of Sterno underneath. Now, La Fiamma, Italian for flame, it gave the whole experience a very trippy Italian feel. It was really the first trendy restaurant in Sudbury and was always full of hippies and business people and students. And on a Friday night, sometimes my parents and their friends, ugh. Oh, they're here again. Oh, no. To this day, whenever I bite into a slice of pizza, I am transported back 50 years to that dark basement. Now, continuing along Durham, I would pass Levine's Ladies' Wear that had a glamorous Hollywood-style spiral staircase that led up to the bridal department. Now, last night, my cousin Carol and I, we wanted to go to Respect is Burning, which is where Levine's used to be, because I wanted to show Carol if she remembered this gorgeous spiral staircase, which she did, but it's no longer there. It was there 5 years ago, and I was so happy and spoke to the manager saying, I can't believe you've kept this this staircase that Mr. Levine himself, he had told me, I went to school with his son Donald, and he had said, I wanted to give this store that real Hollywood glamour, and he was going through, Hollywood books, and he saw this a movie of Betty Davis in it, and only Betty Davis can come down a staircase like no one else. So he built this beautiful staircase that they got rid of. I mean, the restaurant's great, don't get me wrong, but I was really sad to see the staircase gone. Next to Levine's, past Old City Hall Lane, was Burke's Jewelry Store, where at the back of the store, they had a special exhibit set up that I never missed. This intriguing exhibit Burke's had was a table setting with the latest china, cutlery, and anything else that would go in a high-end table setting. The table setting, which changed at least once a month, always impressed me, and I always made sure that every Friday night I would head into Burke's to see what was on there. I always like shiny things. Now, Burke's was on the ground floor of the Colson Hotel, right next to the famous Murray's Restaurant. To anybody who lived in Sudbury in the 1960s, Murray's was a mainstay eatery for all ages. You would enter through a double set of dark wooden-framed oak doors. The restaurant faced out onto Durham Street, had huge windows, and began as a place back in the 1930s when the Colson opened, where after a day of shopping, ladies of the day would head on in for a pot of tea and an apple dumpling. The tea was always served in metal pots with white ceramic cups and saucers. A hostess would greet you, hand you a menu, and then a uniformed waitress would take your order. When you were finished, you would head up to the cashier and pay your bill. Classy without being pretentious. However, during the late 1960s, all this would change when our beloved Murray's and for the world itself was changing. Now, across from Murray's was the venerable Eaton store, and the two bastions of civility in downtown Sudbury complemented each other perfectly. While never really catering to the average teenager like Kresge's and Woolworth's did, I would always include Eaton's on my walk. The store was huge, with 3 floors of shopping, and I remember after you entered through Durham Street, and if you continued right to the back, there was a long annex that went all the way down to Elgin. And it was here that the stoves and the fridges and the dishwashers were all lined up, and in the late 1960s, most were avocado green. Downstairs was my favorite part of Eaton's, as they always had the latest home decor items to fill my little room in my little house with my parents. I remember I was obsessed with collecting Buddha figurines, and I would always wait with bated breath until the next shipment came in. And of all, I might have bought 40 of them, and I have one left from that time. I never remember if Eaton's had a restaurant, but if they did, I never went. But eventually, when it did move into the City Centre Mall, it did have really quite a lovely restaurant at the City Centre. But it made sense that they really wouldn't have one at the one on Durham, because Murray's was just across the store. Crossing Larch and continuing west side of Durham, you would pass the Sudbury Bus Terminal at 121 Durham, now the Family Dental Health. Now that building, which is still standing, still has that little metal awning that I remember standing under, waiting for the bus out to the West End with my mom back in the late 1950s. When the buses moved out, Security's Bakery moved in, and for a while I seem to remember a coffee shop being there. Since Sudbury was on the Trans-Canada Highway, hundreds of young people hitchhiking their way to Toronto would often make a stopover in our fair city. This was the height of the so-called hippie era, when these youthful boys and girls found a lively and fun place in my hometown of Sudbury for a night or sometimes for a few weeks. And for some reason, these sometimes boisterous transients headed straight to Murray's on Durham in the Colson Hotel. Now, Grandma's favorite tea shop all of a sudden became filled with hippies and bikers, causing commotion and dancing on tables, openly smoking pot and running out without pain. It got so uncontrollable for the harried staff that the heavy guns were called in from Toronto's head office to bring order from chaos. Now, the heavy gun that they brought in was another fearsome-looking woman, Mrs. Agnes Smith. And she brought calm to anarchy with her, again, her image burned into my memory, just like the formidable head walker, Mrs. Moore, over at Kresge's. Again, strength with smile. Surprisingly, it worked, and Murray's for a time returned to normal. However, a few years later, Murray's was turned into a gentleman's club with strippers on the tables. Oh, the irony. Now, while Murray's found some success in turning away hippies and other undesirables, the city, on the other hand, were introducing loitering laws to curb what they saw as teenagers causing trouble by standing on the sidewalk. My rock star brother was one of those teenagers who was arrested and jailed while just standing in the corner of Larch and Durham in the summer of 1968. It was big news for the day, as it was seen as a reaction to what was happening south of the border. My dad was furious at the city, as were most of its citizens, and eventually the case was dropped. The back rooms of the Colson were where the taverns sold 20-cent draft. This was a time of men's and ladies' entrances, with one side strictly for men and the other side for ladies. However, a man could enter the ladies' side if accompanied by a woman. I remember the Colson very well during this era, for it was the first time I smoked a joint. My brother was having a party in one of the rooms at the Colson. So, of course, I had to go, even though I was never invited. I knocked on the door, and when I heard, "Who is it?" I jokingly said, "The police." My brother, recognizing my voice, opened the door and said, "Get in, and never say that again. And are you wearing my pants?" I smoked that first joint. And I left, and I was on my way. The one thing you'd always count on standing outside the Colson at Durham and Larch in the late 1960s was Dino the Popcorn Man. A favorite of all ages, from stone teenagers to young couples out on a date. Dino was a fixture in downtown Sudbury, and although he did move his popcorn machine about, he usually stayed on the corner of Durham and Larch. There was always a rumor that if a young man asked for the 10-cent bag, Dino would include a condom in the bottom of the bag. Now, if true, then Dino was doing a great service to the lives of young people back in the 1960s. As you walked along Durham and crossed Larch, you came upon two of Sudbury's most famous delicatessens, Fred and Frank's, side by side for many years. Now, I don't ever remember having a favorite, as both were great. It usually depended on which one had a table. I do remember one historic moment for me that happened in Frank's in the summer of 1969. Now, Frank's, which stood on that location for 70 years before it closed in 2015, was where I met my cousin Carol for a coffee one Friday night. She told me she was going to a music festival in upstate New York, and would I like to come? Now, I was 15 years old in 1969, and although I was old enough to come downtown by myself, my dad said there was no way I was going to go to this music festival a half a world away. Now, disappointed, but on the other hand, when I saw on TV this music festival unfold, over 500,000 people in attendance and all that rain and mud, I remember thinking glad I didn't go, and of course, that festival was Woodstock. While I didn't make it to Woodstock, there were plenty of hippies in Sudbury to make up for it. Illegal drugs were so commonplace in Sudbury in the late 1960s that if you knew where to look, you could get what you wanted. Back then, I never ever went beyond smoking that one slim joint, but I knew people who were doing LSD and MDA and a few who were doing hardcore heroin. There was someone in my high school who was shooting heroin, and she told me she could handle it as long as she only did a little piece at a time. One day she wasn't there anymore, and I never saw her again. I have no idea if she OD'd or just left town. Now, biker gangs controlled the drug trade in Sudbury, with hashish coming in from Montreal. With the most popular gangs were in Sudbury were the Mongols and the White Lightning, followed by the Plague, Satan's Choice, the Coffin Wheelers, the Outlaws, and Hell's Angels later year. Now, the clubhouse, which seemed to pass from one gang to the next, was behind the old Prospect Hotel. Now, at 16, I was absolutely fascinated with biker gangs, and it amazes me to this day, considering my association with these hardened bikers, that I live to tell the tale. On a Saturday afternoon, most of the White Lightning biker gang hung out in the Richmond Room at Kresge's, and later on in the day, they moved into the Manhattan restaurant on Cedar Street, later to be known as the Trevi. So there I was, hanging with one of the most dangerous, corrupt, and illegal gangs in the history of Canada, and loving every minute of it. However, to be fair, my association with this criminal enterprise never got beyond sitting next to them in the Richmond Room, awkwardly mumbling a few words, "How are you?" and the occasional hello on the street, but I felt like a badass nonetheless. Gang member Billy Boy was always very nice to me, asking me what I wanted to do when I left school. He was the ultimate bad boy, and with his boyish good looks, he was very popular with the ladies. Sadly, Billy was shot to death in a parking lot out in New Sudbury by a rival gang, and his demise was part of that ongoing biker war that ultimately saw more bike members being gunned down in the streets of Sudbury in the late 1960s and early 70s. And with it ended my involvement, however brief, with Sudbury's biker gangs. Now, Durham Street on a Friday night was hopping, with hundreds of teenagers descending on Sudbury's main drag. The most happening place in the 1960s was the Inferno Club on Medina Lane behind Reg Wilkinson's menswear store, and I'm glad Reg Wilkinson is still there. He's been there, on Durham since I was a kid. Loved seeing that yesterday. The ornate building that housed both the Inferno and Reg Wilkinson still stands today and is my absolute favorite building in Sudbury, the Northern Ontario building, an Art Deco masterpiece that I pray that no future developer will get their hands on. Now, the Inferno Club, where my brother played and his band, they played there every weekend. The club was upstairs through a side door down the laneway, where 100 or so people would be packed in. John told me recently, as wild and as fun as it was also a death trap. And thank God I have a fire never broke out at the Inferno Club. Again, the irony. Although I wasn't old enough to enter the Inferno, I had all of Durham Street to entertain me. Every now and then on a Friday night, when I saw a wandering lost teen who looked like he or she was newly arrived on the Trans-Canada Highway, I would always introduce myself and then direct visitors to a very interesting and fascinating part of Sudbury's hippie culture. The hot spot I directed people to was a dirty little former warehouse tucked away behind the courthouse on Elm Street. This was the hostel, a city-run hostel, the first of its kind in Sudbury, catering specifically to the youth who were hitchhiking across Canada. I went there a few times, and I remember seeing mattresses flung across the floor and a little canteen set up at the back. Bare to the bones and very communal, with guys and girls all sleeping rough together on the same floor. Shocking, I'm sure, for some of Sudbury's older residents, but this was the it place to be seen. At this time also, there were other discotheques that were competing for that youth market. There was the Hub on Durham next to the Inferno Club, and the Joint on Elm Street, an old warehouse that was ultimately destroyed when the city center was built. Another hot spot in the summer of 1969 was at the former Fairway Golf Club near the flour mill. The club and golf course was closed the year previous because construction on the new Ryan Heights was about to begin. So for that summer, that old clubhouse was turned into a 3 floor disco. And I remember it well, for it was the first time I ever saw lava lamp images projected on the wall and ceiling with multicolored psychedelic globs. A very iconic 60s moment. I loved Friday nights in Sudbury because the stores stayed open to 9 o'clock. And my favorite store back then was Wolf's Bookstore at the apex of Elgin and Durham. My high school friend Miriam was Wolf's daughter, so she would work Friday nights and on the second floor, and that's where I was always headed. Miriam always showed me the latest books that came in, and once in a while we would glance through the more adult books, mostly medical journals, that would come in. Wolf's was an iconic bookstore, not just for its incredible selection, but also for its location. Upstairs from the bookstore was an artist loft, and I remember going to a few wild parties there in 1969. There was always a rattan chair hanging from the ceiling in that little alcove overlooking the intersection of Elgin and Durham that hung there for years. In other words, rattan chair equals hippies, equals subculture, equals fun times. Now, I grew up in a time when the term free love and sexual promiscuity was thrown about with little and no thought given to the consequences. However, gay sex was still illegal until June of 1969 and could land you in the sanitarium convicted, like it happened to someone I knew who I went to school with. Now, Simon, not his real name, was an out gay guy in my high school, something that was incredibly brave to do. However, his teachers and parents and the courts thought best thing for him was a series of shock treatments at the Sudbury Algomas Sanatorium, which was an operation from 1948 to 74 in order to cure him of his homosexual attractions. He told me he was caught having sex with a man in the washroom at the former Greyhound bus station on Elm, and he was taken to the sanatorium. There, Simon was hooked up to electrodes that shocked him every time a naked man appeared on the screen. And the only way to stop this electrocution was to press another button that would show a naked woman, with the hope that he would be cured. Brilliant! It wasn't just gay men who had to endure this barbaric torture at the sanatorium, but also women who were perceived as too easy also met the same fate. On a lighter note, it was during this time I got invited to an orgy at the White Lightning Biker Club in the summer of 1969. I was thrilled to be invited until I looked up orgy in the dictionary. I became traumatized at the thought, and I never went. Now, downtown Sudbury began or ended depending on which way you entered the downtown core at Wolf's Bookstore, for beyond Wolf's was the Elgin Street Strip. Now, back in the 1960s, this little strip of Elgin Street between Durham and the Sudbury Arena was known as the Scary Zone. Now, today that strip, known as Shops of Upper Elgin, where the Laughing Buddha, where we ended up having dinner last night, and that backyard, beautiful. It was really quite trendy, but in the late 1960s, this was a very sinister part of town. Sometimes when heading to the Sudbury Arena, I'd find myself in that part of Elgin amongst the beer-soaked taverns and secondhand stores and pawn shops and the lost souls, as if left over from the Great Depression. It was like walking through a John Steinbeck novel. I remember at this time pinching our family's vacuum cleaner and pawning it for $2, then retrieving it a few days later before anyone knew. I also remember doing this with my mom's electric curling iron set and silverware and my dad's tool set, but I was always very swift enough to get things back before people knew. Now, in hindsight, as guilty as I feel now, I do wish I had the guts to spend more time in Sudbury Skid Row, for behind those faces I saw on the street were incredible stories of survival and endurance. Although most of the downtown of my youth, and a lot of us here today, is gone, have a profound love of my birthplace that has never waned throughout the years. If it wasn't for my strict and loving parents and my favorite high school teacher, Mrs. O'Malley, who introduced me to the joys of theater that brought me to the spot where I stand right now, I don't know how I would have ended up. My dad worked for Inco, deep in the mines out in Creighton for 40 years, so that today his son can sit in front of a computer in Toronto and wax poetic about a teenagehood that is now lost among parked cars and vanished buildings. Like most people my age, I can remember the tiniest detail from 50 years ago, but I can't remember why I came into the kitchen just now. The rebirth of Sudbury's landscape is breathtaking, and for that I am grateful. But oh, how I long for my Friday night walks along Durham Street on a Sudbury summer's eve. Thank you. Thanks. What time is it? Thank you. I was told I had an hour, and that was exactly an hour. Ta-da!